minutes late, y'all.
No worries. I'm going to make you co-host. We're having Zoom issues today. We don't know why. It fell off everyone's calendar. So, all right, Kels, are you recording?
I think so. Did it give you a message that I was recording? Every, everything. Yes, I think I am recording.
It says recording,
Yeah.
so let's do it. Okay. All right. I want to get started just because I want to have enough time. And we're gonna do things, we're gonna mix it up a little bit today, and we are gonna start off first. We had a great trip to Anchorage, Alaska, to the Native, Tribal, and Indigenous Climate Conference. And we had the best session of storytelling. So we just wanted to give Kelsey, who led that effort for our team, some time to just kind of, just maybe 5, 10 minutes, Kelsey, just to discuss how that went and kind of the results of NTIC and our storytelling segment.
Yeah, and I'm glad you emailed me this morning to give me a little heads up that you wanted me to say something because I had time to like pull up a few slides from our presentation to share. So I'm gonna share my
Oh,
screen.
good.
Um, okay, is this working? Okay. So for people who
Yeah, it
don't know
looks
anything
good.
about our climate reporter program, I just wanted to kind of briefly introduce what it is that we were doing, and then I'll tell you about how Alaska went. We, since the beginning of this Native Climate Project, have had a climate reporter program going on. And the goals of our program, we have a few different goals of it, but one of the goals of the program is to help increase awareness of the impacts of climate change on Native communities. We know through all these meetings that we've had with the working group and through other workshops that Vicki and Kyle and Maureen and other folks have done that climate change is having such a extreme impact on a lot of Native communities. So kind of helping to get the word out about what some of those impacts are and how people are being resilient to that and adapting and responding. Secondly, to encourage respect for Indigenous climate adaptation knowledge and practices among Western scientists and the public. And third, to provide training for students who are interested in journalism or other types of multimedia communication. So one of the things that we try really hard to encourage people to do in the storytelling is to make connections between climate data and stories from their communities. So kind of using the stories from the communities as ways to provide examples of how things are changing or what those changes specifically look like, and then connecting that with climate data that really shows the larger trends and how, these stories are not necessarily just isolated examples. These are things that are happening in a lot of different places, and kind of how the data can support or help us learn more about what is happening in these regions. So this summer we did things, so the past year or two, we had climate reporters on board sort of individually, and I was working one-on-one with them. And then this past summer, we tried having a more of like a cohort style model, where we had 3 climate reporters join from different parts of the country, and go through a more structured like 10-week internship program. So we met about twice a week to practice different steps in the reporting process. We talked about like where to find story ideas, where to find climate data, how to pitch stories, how to kind of plan where you want to go with your story, how to do interviews. Kyle worked with us a lot on finding like specific data sets that aligned well with the stories that they were looking to tell. We worked on photography, just kind of all the different steps that go into putting together a multimedia story. Um, and so it was really, I think, I had a lot of fun with the experience, and I hope they did as well. We were all remote. We met in person for the first time when we went up to Alaska, which was really cool. And so up in Alaska, we had Mary Kathleen Wilson, who's from Tohono Nation, and Shakota Nez, who's Diné. They were able to travel up there with us in person. And then Andra Hawk Valdez, who is from the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. She's Hunkpapa Lakota. And she was able to participate virtually by like pre-recording a presentation. But they came up and shared the stories they'd worked on this summer. And then we had sort of an interactive session as well, where we asked people in the audience how climate change was impacting them in their parts of the country and asked people to share some of those stories with us. So it was a neat sharing of stories, and they did really beautiful work. Kathy did a fabulous story on, let's see, I think I have her slides up here. Hers was called the Tona Otham Himdag, Challenging the Climate Science View on Indigenous Climate Impacts. And all these stories are available on the Native Climate website, so I won't have time to go into great detail about what any of their stories were, but if you're interested in checking out some of their work, I'll share the link in the chat. But that was Kathy's story. Andy has done some really beautiful climate change poetry. She lives on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, and that is on our website as well. And then Shakota did a neat story about the Santa Cruz River and how it has changed over time from being this beautiful river that was well taken care of by the people that lived there to the impacts of civilization and all the development that has occurred in the greater Tucson region, and then efforts by the local tribe to kind of bring back parts of the river and how that contrasts with what some of the city of Tucson has been doing there. So all really neat stories, all really different. I will share a link in the chat to where you can find their stories if you'd like to check them out, but they're all continuing to work on more stories now. Kathy had started a number of stories over the summer that she's trying to bring to completion in the next month or two. Andy is working on some like climate poetry lesson plan. She works in an elementary school, so she's working on how to kind of bring some of what she's been working on to the kids in her elementary school. And then Shakota's continuing to add to the story she had been building and I think turn it into a story map. So they're continuing to do really fun things. But yeah, that's sort of a quick overview and a little bit about our Alaska experience.
Is this me or is she? Kels, you might have to turn off your screen. You keep freezing up.
Oh no, could you hear me when I was saying that?
Yeah, we could hear
No.
you. That
Okay.
was great. Thank you so much, Kelsey. Yeah.
Is it still showing my screen? I turned off the
Yes, we could see your screen. All right, Vic, what's next?
Okay, all right. So next, we just want to do some announcements from our partners. Do we have anything that needs to be brought up? I always like to go to Janice first. Janice, do we have any announcements from NIFA and USDA?
Well, the big one has now passed. So we all attended Falcon this past weekend, and it was an absolutely incredible conference. Hey, Kyle. So I've taken that off my announcements. But upcoming, we do have first Tuesday tribal stakeholder meeting. The next one will be on Tuesday, November 5th, 1 to 2:30 Central. And I believe, although don't hold me to this, I believe that we will have the president and CEO of AHEC for that. And that is also Native American Heritage Month. And there will be multiple other things happening throughout the USDA to honor that. But I don't have a current list of everything that is happening right now. The only other thing that we really have coming up, just put a plug in for the Intertribal Agriculture Council Conference, which will be happening December 10th through 12th at Holmes in Las Vegas. And prior to that, on Monday, December 9th, we have Indian Country Extension Day. And so that's all I have for right now.
All right, thank you. Anyone from the Native Climate team have any updates? Good to see everyone. Katie, I haven't seen you in a while, so good to see you. Kyle, anything?
Well, we had a great workshop at the Falcon Conference on the first, it was a pre-conference workshop where we were really focusing on this data set of tribal climate projections from 633 different native areas. That's all available at nativeclimate.com/projections. Kelsey, if you don't mind popping that in the chat, I'd be much obliged. We also got to partner with Eden, the Extension Drought or Extension Disaster Education Network, and heard from Monty just about the incredible work that they're doing with the hurricanes out in the east currently, and some of the resources that they have across the nation for disaster education and disaster response. So it was a great workshop. We'll get a post up about how successful it was. But thank you all for those of you who were there and for the support.
Okay, let's roll right into our featured topic. And Kyle, I'm going to let you introduce him. Dr. Charles Kyle saw your presentation being advertised last month, and we just got right on it. And so we're thrilled to have you. So with that, Kyle, I'll let you introduce him, and then we're excited to hear from you. You're on
Yes,
oh,
we
there
are
we go.
really fortunate to have Dr. Charles here. Dr. Charles gave a webinar for the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, which is down in the Four Corners region in southwestern Colorado. And when I saw his topic and saw the recording of his talk, I just knew that he would be great for a Native Climate monthly meetup. So Dr. Michael Charles is Diné. He's a citizen of the Navajo Nation and an assistant professor in the Department of Biological and Environmental Engineering at Cornell University. Dr. Charles's research focuses on the intersections of computational sustainable design, ecological modeling, and community engagement, particularly with Indigenous communities. More specifically, his work explores the role that ecosystems and landscapes can provide in sustainable engineering, climate regulation, public health, and the development of sustainability metrics. And today he's going to be talking with us about how he uses data, computer science, code, analytics to protect and empower Indigenous people's livelihoods and their livelihoods, especially through this lens of food sustainability and food sovereignty. So, Dr. Charles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Can everyone see that?
Yes, it's coming through great.
Perfect. Yeah, and I just want to say thank you. And I'm seeing this talk mostly as just a way to introduce myself to you all. So think of it mostly as an invitation to continue talking about any of these topics, because I'm going to go kind of quickly through some projects. But yeah, I just wanted to say it's really interesting how many places we have seemed to have been in the same spot with a number of these things without that direct running into each other yet. Because I was thinking about I just led a pre-conference workshop for Falcon maybe 2 years ago around the Land Grant Partners Summit, and I think I remember the climate one being at the exact same time.
That's right, down in Albuquerque. No, you're exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I was like, that's so funny. And then I was looking, actually, one of my students is working on a project that we had come across the climate projections data, like before you all had even emailed me. And so I was like, I just got familiar with your data set probably within the week after reaching out after the Crow Canyon webinar. So I'm really excited to be here. Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit today around some of the strategies we do for how do we use data and computer science. What has been a little bit of my journey, but also kind of how do I think that this can continue to work from kind of within institutional walls? What is the good work that we can do to really help our communities? So I'm going to first just introduce myself in my own language. So Michael Charles Yaneshe, Bilagana Nishle, Shihibashichin, Bilagana Dashe Nakai Dana Additionally. So my name is Michael. I come from the Ganado area in Northeast Arizona from the Navajo Nation. And then I come from the Salt People clans and then the Mexican Navajo as well. And so I'm been really excited to kind of continue to explore across a pretty early career still, but just trying to figure out this constant journey of how do we continue to take all of these things that we're learning and try to figure out what that application looks back home. And so, yeah, today I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the start of my lab, some of the ways that we've been trying to pursue this somewhat methodologically, but then give a little overview of some projects. And I'll admit that most of them are what I'll call half-baked, a lot of preliminary results, but still have yet to kind of formally package them. And some of that's because my oldest students have only been with me for about 2 years now. So kind of introducing this, one of the ways that I've really been trying to think through, and this is like an evolving image that I think I have changed multiple times, and I draw it differently, I think, on a monthly basis in my notebook. But I'm really interested around how do we continue to use educational institutions to challenge us as Indigenous people and students and scholars intellectually, but then use that to really figure out how do we address the needs of the community and continue to take our work home, even if that means that we're not directly at home. And so that's been kind of a theme of my life academically, has been jumping from university to university. I moved first across out east, basically from Arizona to Colorado to New York was when I was an undergrad, back to Ohio, where I did my graduate work, and then back to New York again. And so it's constantly been this bridging. How do I connect some of the work I'm doing back home? And a lot of that has been trying to a constant evolution, I would say, of the work. And so, again, I've shifted really towards computational research. I would like to say that part of it is because of that motivation to be able to work remotely and impact things back home. But I guess more honestly, it would be because I worked in a biomedical lab and hated working in the lab so much. Um, and so yeah, so I've taken a lot of time to try to figure out what I think are some of these more practical ways to continue working. And I think one of the biggest things I've learned is just this continual cycle between our ability to train and build capacity, I would say, within the institution. So whether that's through student advising, education, or the actual technical skills, it's a co-development between that and continuing to like carry the relationships we have with the community, taking that time to do the listening, to do kind of share what we're working on, and see where we're matching and missing the mark in terms of these community needs, whether it's the project development or I would say even more, a little bit more detailed would be if there's any need for additional data collection, and trying to come up with these projects where we can think about how do we use our skills within the institution to bring resources back to the community to address these issues. And I think also a huge focus on training students from those communities. And so that's still a lot of work to do in the pipeline in terms of recruiting students. But I will say some of the first project you'll see has been conducted completely by a native student who's an undergraduate who's been doing a lot of work with me and was able to actually do some of the work from home as well over the summers while he was back on his own traditional lands. And so, yeah, there's a whole nother part. Yeah, again, I think within the outreach and communication, what can we offer? One thing that I really try to kind of take from our traditional teachings is really that idea of reciprocity. So anytime that we're trying to come up with a grant where we need a community partner, we spend as much time as we ask them to think about what can we offer to those communities back. And so an example of that has been working with some of the tribes back out in Utah, where I've been personally kind of grant writing for a nonprofit that's been putting on powwows out there. And so I've been making sure that anytime I ask them for community input, or if we're going to have a sharing circle within the community at an event like this, that we play a major role in making sure the funding's there. And so that's kind of, I guess, some of the basics of what we're doing in terms of thinking about how to use research as a training grounds for Indigenous scholars, but also really focusing towards that community output. And I think the products that we end up developing are kind of on this side, on the edge, where it's really around information and data, spatial maps, software tools that are going to be usable by the community. And obviously for kind of to meet the goals and needs to keep me hired, we have to write those in journals and things like that. But we make sure that every project we have has some sort of community output or usable data set or tool that really is going to not just sit within a journal article that won't get read. The main thing that we're really trying to address, I would say, with some of this information is usually around either safety or empowerment. So analyzing risks where there might be issues for the safety of Indigenous peoples, vulnerabilities, whether it's dispossession, whether it's inherent safety of people, and then also empowerment, thinking about how do we use information as a tool to make better decisions within our own self-governance, or to use it to advocate. And so what I mean by that is usually putting it into a language that is going to translate better towards court cases, towards policy, towards any kind of, I guess, where a lot of the decisions made based on what is the data, where's the numbers, and a lot of times we see a gap between the communities being able to provide that in the language, I guess, that would be as usually being requested. And so that's somewhere where we try to help fill in that gap. So this is just a few ideas. It's a really busy map just to say today we're going to talk about 2 projects kind of quickly, but I wanted to do a very quick overview of just 4 projects just to get a better idea, I think, of some of the projects that we take on in case there's more interest and overlap and maybe things I don't talk about today. But I want to, again, make this an invitation to continue the conversation. So I'm going to skip the 2 that are marked in around with the board, the black box, because that's going to be what I dive into a little bit more today. But I want to talk a little bit about a current collaboration we have with Atanuvik, which is up in northern Quebec, over in Nunavik. And so what this has been a research governance organization that has recently been funded, and what they're looking for is kind of a baseline of how do we understand all of the research that has been going on in these lands that they're going to be governing, so in Nunavik. And so what we've been kind of tasked to do is come up with a research atlas, so some sort of interactive map that can actually display all sorts of publications, whether it's directly from journals, so kind of that white literature, or the gray literature, things that are in their own tribal language, in French, in English. I think that's where we're getting a lot of interesting hiccups, which is in translating everything. But trying to come up with how do we organize this? How do we make this useful to community members? And one of the ways that we've been able to kind of add an interesting component that's both going to be a good research direction, but also makes it more practical, has been around using community workshops to come up with how would a local member of the community actually be interested in looking for this research. And I guess the direct example would be, rather than looking whether what came out of a department from natural resources or anthropology, ecology, things like that, we've seen a lot more appetite for filtering things by fishing, coastal management, climate impacts, hunting, trapping, and anything more on that end. So we've been trying to take community-based categorizations and actually reclassify all this data. And we're dealing with I think around 9,000 sources of literature right now. And so building an AI natural language processing model to filter through everything. And so that's kind of an example of, actually, that's one project that was brought to us where they're like, we don't know how to do this. Here's some interest. And we're like, well, we can mix this into a new direction, of AI, which is this hot topic. Let's see how we can figure this out and write a proposal. And what has been great is then we can get funding for all the community workshops and try to give back as much in terms of those resources, again, while training a student to build those models. The other one I wanted to talk about a little bit is this integrated assessment models for economic risks of climate, specific to tribal governments. I think this is where there is a lot of overlaps, particularly with those projection data sets that were just published. I'm not going to talk about that today because a lot of the results on that end are still either brand new and haven't been really packaged yet, or a lot of it, or we're still kind of going through. But essentially, what we're working on here is looking at the global integrative assessment models that look at climate change and try to connect national governments and things like that to look at maybe the impacts on water stress or the impacts on food based on basically economic markets, usually macroeconomics driven. We're trying to do that, but building it from the bottom up with tribal economies. And so we're starting to do that by connecting these downscaled global climate models, which I assume is actually very similar to what has just been published in those projected climate sets. And we've been working on connecting those specific to agricultural models and then trying to tune those models to specific local species or local plant products that would be more part part of the actual economies, I would say, given a different tribal community. So that's kind of one thing we're also working on, and then trying to connect the agricultural impacts of the economic impacts with the energy sector. And that's kind of where it overlaps as well with these impacts of renewable energy transition on Indigenous lands. So that's, I guess, a quick overview of some of the things we're working on. I'm going to do a bit deeper dive into two of those projects. The first is going to be around land grab universities and their impacts on Indigenous food systems. So again, also where that connection was with the pre-workshop for Falcon, trying to connect the impacts of land-grant universities and where there could potentially be collaborations there. And then we'll also talk about a project that has been kind of, I would say, it is still in motion, but has a good amount of preliminary data, just hasn't been really shaped yet into a polished presentation, but I'll kind of show some of the examples of what we have over there. So first, I want to just talk a little bit about the land grab institutions. As I mentioned, this is what I talked about for the Crow Canyon webinar, so I'm going to kind of keep it short, try not to be too repetitive. But I think there's some interesting backgrounds here where we get to kind of connect different things that we might not piece together and how they impact power and institutions and how they impact the current state of Indigenous peoples. So again, I don't think there's a ton I have to talk about in terms of the legacy and history of Indigenous dispossession. But I think specifically we'll think about some of those numbers. About 1.5 billion acres were seized between 1776 and 87. And again, I think what surprised me as I was diving in a little bit to this research was that that number has increased by 90 million acres from the 1880s forward. I don't know what I was thinking in my head of just like, oh, we were given this land and it's been pretty static. That's not the case. We have been losing land from the 1880s. And what's also just kind of interesting to me has been the impact of like what it means to move from place to place, especially as Indigenous people, Indigenous knowledge systems. And so kind of one point I always say here is that survivors really did have to build new livelihoods and knowledge systems on new lands. And just want to emphasize that before we go deeper. And again, I know I don't probably have to preach all this to this group as well. And this is just a nice little animation around kind of how this dispossession happened over time. So the blue land being those Indigenous lands that got swept and turned into tribal lands or federally recognized reservations. And so I find this kind of a more powerful map and visualization of the last slide as well. So there was a pretty interesting paper that came out a couple years ago that was published in Science that was really looking at the impacts of dispossession in North America. And what's interesting is we see, you know, aside from the land tenure, which is that kind of big circle down to the small circle, what's really interesting is this was one of those papers that started to map out, you know, what's been the impact or the cause in terms of where we came from to where different communities landed in terms of the exposure to extreme heat, the access to precipitation, and then they also looked at mineral value potential. And what I guess wouldn't be super surprising is they found kind of they found basically negative impacts across the board, and looked at kind of how do we map out all sorts of these metrics of dispossession, and what have been those impacts on food system. And so there's a lot of things that we also haven't looked at in terms of or haven't been able to quantify as well, which is kind of the impacts of fragmenting the land. So what's the difference between land area when it's all together and more communal versus, for example, like the Oklahoma land rush, which really was around tearing those communities apart physically by creating space in between. And then we also haven't done really, there's very little research around lack of federally or state recognized lands. And then, the rest of these I think is pretty straightforward. But what we wanted to kind of put this into is really, what does this have to do with land grant institutions? And I think part of this is because most of my entire educational career has been at these land grant institutions, but it's also been in response to the Land Grab University article that was published in 2020 by Lee and Atone. And that really set the kind of a tone for really putting pressure on universities that have built these huge endowments. But we'll start kind of at the beginning of that story, which is with the Morrill Act of 1862, which essentially distributed these public domain lands to states. And the public domain lands were really the lands that had just been taken from the Indian Removal Act. And now that they've been deemed public lands, how do we use this to support public education? That's where the Morrill Act came in. It essentially took that land, endowed it to land grant institutions, and really had this mission around making higher education more accessible and focus on practical sciences like agriculture. What's interesting is they still keep that mission, and land grant institutions often talk about this as well, around kind of the praise of where they're acting on kind of a higher level of integrity, where it's really around the teaching, the research, and then a commitment to service and community. Public engagement, I think, is the main pillar that they use. And so what's really interesting about this story is really thinking about how well are we doing, and are we really serving the communities we need to as institutions? Nearly 11 million acres were redistributed through the Morrill Act. And as I mentioned, Lena Tone published this great investigative report that actually was able to track about 99% of those parcels, exactly mapping out where that land came from. It was used to endow 52 institutions. And what's interesting as well, I think, is that the land grants at the time of 1862, they were offered proportionately to the size of the state's population. And at the time, Indigenous peoples were not even considered citizens. So it kind of shows an extra mark of, I guess, the history and the impact it had in terms of how these decisions were made. And we'll talk a little bit more about the impacts it has today. It's also just kind of thinking around including the Morrill Act of 1890. Wanted to mention that this is another list, I guess, of these land grant institutions. This one specifically established historically black colleges and universities. And then in 1994, another wave of land grant institutions came, and that's the founding that established these tribal colleges as well. So it's interesting that these are all connected as well at this point, where we have these historical endowments, but there's a huge inequity in the resources that were actually distributed, and obviously the timeline in which they happened. So if you haven't read this report already, read this. They do a much better job than I think we ever will do. But it's a really interesting website as well. If you go to landgrabu.org, which basically is able, you can go through, you can pick which state or university you're interested in looking at. It'll connect all sorts of, it'll give you an interactive map to give you some of the data, the money that was raised in the endowment, but also map out all the points that are associated with the universities. Again, I mentioned that it located over 99% of the Morrill Act land, and was able to connect it with the indigenous inhabitants. This was through using session data. So looking at this historic signing nations as it's listed in the session databases. So one of the ways we looked at this was, how do we connect this work around dispossession due to the Morrill Act and connect it with that previous work we talked about, which was mapping out the impacts of dispossession. So this one, we're essentially able to recreate using some of our own data sets or utilizing our own different data sets, I would say, than what was done in the Nature paper to basically fit the application a bit better. And so the question we had was, can we build on the LandGrabU data set by exploring the impacts of the Morrill Act of 1862 on the current indigenous food systems, particularly in the U.S. So one of the things that we've been looking through is what data sets do exist. The ones that we have really started with are around food production, specifically from the USDA, using the National Commodity Crop Productivity Index, where we have kind of specific metrics for commodity crops like corn, cotton, and soybean. And then they also have mapped out the average value to kind of look at a proxy for food productivity. As for food security, we've been working with the data sets from Feeding America, where they have data for food insecurity rates, childhood food insecurity rates, the budget shortfall, so how much money has been missing the mark to meet kind of full food security, and then what's the cost per meal in that county. And then we're also been looking at meteorological conditions. And what's interesting from this is, I think this is also a way that we could be thinking about how to look at predicted climate dispossession or induced impacts from climate change, and looking at the differences between land, where we're able to kind of measure meteorological conditions and consider that essentially a proxy for the ability for a community's historical knowledge to really continue to be effective. And so in that sense, we kind of think about Indigenous knowledge systems, how they've been crafted, and what is at risk when we either move them to a new land, or in the same context, we could talk about in the projected sense of climate change as well. And so in this case, we'll be looking at the differences of meteorological conditions and what we assume and that would mean in terms of looking at the growing season. So the end goal of this project has really been around creating an online data visualization platform that will look at those impacts on food systems, but really have a way to sort through the data. And I think that's something that is always interesting with these large data sets is there's so much information there. It's really hard to usually pull out what's even interesting or how that applies to a specific community. So one thing that we did spend a lot of time on was actually connecting a data set that looked at all the historic signing nations that are from these sessions, connecting it directly to the present day tribes that would impact. And so now present day tribes could use this sort of data set to look at for their specific tribe, what has been that impact on food production, security, meteorological conditions. And at this point, we still have tons and tons of data, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The short answer is yes, we've been able to do this. We've had written the code. We are able to produce all this data. Like I mentioned, it's too much data that part of it is going to be creating this tool that actually makes more sense of it. So this is just an example of, we have the list of tribes and we have all these numbers that represent food productivity, food security. We have temperature and precipitation at a monthly level of resolution. We've also looked at that across data sets from 1980 to 2020. So we also have statistical indices for each tribe where it has the mean temperature, that kind of standard variation. And so what we've ended up with is essentially too much data and the need for making a useful platform. And so that's what we're really working on right now. Here's examples of some of the data we will be putting into this because we've run some figures with our initial data. We do have the data sets done, and again, we're just kind of anticipating. We're working on the app development right now, and so we're hoping it'll be done around December. I have a student who's working on it. Actually, one of the goals that was brought up, the Intertribal Ag Council conference in December, that was one of the goals we set internally with the student working on this, was hopefully to try to get a packaged software to maybe present there as well. But essentially what we're looking at is these change in food security rates against the change in food production potential. So if we wanted to look at the impacts of all of the Morrill Act, which is the figure here, here's one way in which we could look at these impacts by specific tribes. So which ones have really been at the bottom in terms of the impacts of food security rate or impacts of change in food production potential. There's obviously a lot of negative impacts overall. We also are really careful not to ever say that there was a positive impact from the Morrill Act. So we usually, even if it says, the change in food security rate has increased or change in food production potential, there's usually a backstory there. But we never give credit to the Morrill Act and dispossession for any of the positive impacts. So just a couple of things to note. And then in terms of, I mentioned the meteorological dynamics, this is also kind of what we're able to produce at this level. We also have it for those interested more in statistics. We do have error bars in the app development that we're doing, but it shows kind of the changing curves. This was specifically for the Kickapoo tribe in Texas, looking at the temperature change where there was a clear increase in that temperature and a huge decrease in precipitation based on that dispossession and forced migration. So I just wanted to give a flavor for one of the projects we're working on. Again, hopefully we'll have a full published tool that anyone can kind of explore, and I'll make sure to kind of share those links when they go live so anyone can kind of play with that data later. And I also wanted to give a quick overview around this idea around looking at the impacts of renewable energy transitions, and particularly those unintended impacts on Indigenous lands. I think a lot of times we make these big demands knowing that we need to have these rapid changes, but we often forget the consequences of who's at risk when we try to make decisions too quickly and move too fast. And so this is just an idea of trying to connect, as much as we do need this rapid change of our energy systems, we are in the current, in the current climate crisis. What was interesting to me, the every day in 2023 was 1 degree warmer than the baseline levels, which is the first time that happened for every single day of a year. And I think what's interesting is we do know that the Indigenous community, us as people, right, we're at the front line of climate vulnerability, but we're also at the kind of bottom level of that political power, which makes us vulnerable. So when tougher decisions that have these consequences or these trade-offs come to question, the real question is who's looking out for us, who's at risk. And so the idea with this project is to really start outlining spatially, could we look at maps of, here's where we're going to see these change of projections in terms of mineral resources needed. Here's where those the known mineral deposits are. And here's the communities that are sitting right on top of those that are going to be most vulnerable when it comes to making cheaper zero carbon technologies. So that's the overall goal of this project. I'm just going to kind of go quickly through. These are some of the data sets we're using. This is from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. This is how they basically are projecting future energy scenarios. It's all driven by the market. So again, looking at basically input-output models of where supply and demands meet. So just all economically charged. And these are kind of the current mainstream scenarios that we're looking at right now. Since there's so many acronyms, I'll just kind of mention them out loud. This is the Inflation Reduction Act. So they look at what happens if we don't have that Inflation Reduction Act, what happens if we implement it in a low scale, what happens if we do it at a high scale. We have low economic growth scenarios, high economic growth, low, this is the zero carbon technology costs. So whether or not those renewable energies are cheaper or more expensive changes these scenarios. And then one kind of reference and meant to be the middle of the road scenario. And so this figure that I'm showing is the percentage. This is all going to be the amount of renewable energy needed compared to the actual final demand or the total energy demand, which is these dashed lines at the top. Again, I know I'm flying through this, but if there are more specific questions, maybe we'll get to them at the end so that we can kind of have time for questions. This is just an idea of what each of those scenarios has. Is it to the level shows a prediction number of exactly where that energy is going to come from. So seeing kind of a decrease in this for the reference, natural gas, nuclear, and then see basically biggest increases in solar photovoltaics. Again, geothermal is one we talk about a lot, but even in projections, going to be a very small amount of actual energy. Getting a notice that internet connection is unstable. So let me know if there's any issues, but I'm going to keep going forth for now. So what do we do in our lab? We were able to kind of take all this data. We do a lot of work around sustainability analysis. This was all coming from actually one of my an undergraduate's senior's honors thesis that's been done. I haven't been able to kind of shape up everything yet. So it's a mixture of things I've worked on versus things I pulled directly from the report, just to give a good idea of where we're at. And so we basically take all of those energy projection scenarios that I showed. We connect those to databases that look at the current state of technology. What does it take to make 1 kilowatt hour of solar photovoltaic energy versus 1 kilowatt hour of coal? And what we're able to do there is try to look at what's going to be the required resources for that across the entire supply chain. So not just while the solar voltaics are installed and taking in electricity, but all the way up from the starting of where we're mining those materials and what's needed to create each technology. So we've categorized some of these minerals with such an interest on the subsurface in this project. This is kind of the way we've categorized the minerals from primary to secondary to other major sources of subsurface minerals, including kind of rare earth metals. So this is an example of if we're going to look at specifically aluminum and the amount of mass that we're going to need to kind of meet these different standards. So we're looking at to the 10 to the 8th power, so 100 millions of these kilograms for meeting, and this is each year to meet the different scenarios that we've outlined. So kind of the intuitive is if zero carbon technology is really cheap, we're going to need a ton of aluminum, but we can expect that that's going to be the most rapid form of this energy transition. So if we're going to need that much aluminum, it's good to question where's that going to come from? Who's going to be impacted? And on the other end, we can see if we kind of different versions of this as well. So the reference state is somewhere right here in the middle. I believe it's this light blue. And then kind of all of these that are going to see this change in renewable energy just is going to require more minerals. Again, another case where we have too much data to make sense of at this point, but here's some of the first things we're looking at. We're also able to look at the impact assessment. So outside of just the minerals, what else can we pull from life cycle assessment inventories? We're utilizing different impact assessments to look at impacts to human health, ecosystems health, and natural resources. So for one example is looking at connecting the land use, so the per kilowatt hour, what's going to be the amount of land we need based on current practices, again, to produce each of these, to produce the energy that we're saying we're using. And so this was kind of a summary of the results we had around land use, where solar photovoltaic is going to need the most space just to have access to the sun. Coal also uses a huge amount basically from mining all the way to building the right technology, and hydropower using the least. And then we can also look at the impacts on climate change and all sorts of other metrics, but just wanted to kind of show again, rather than going too deep into this, showing the type of information that we are collecting throughout this project. When it comes to the spatial assessment, I'm going to show very kind of the preliminary results for this as well. But what we've been looking at is mapping all the known mineral deposits in the United States. We found 35,000 of them, comparing them with what we're considering critical areas. So including tribal lands, parks and forests, and then highly populated areas as well. And then we've put a little bit of buffer around, so we have a 10-kilometer radius from any certain point. That's kind of where we see why everything looks a little bit more rounded. And so this is an example in Wyoming at a higher resolution of here's different mineral deposits, here's how we have created these spatial layers. And then across the country, here's again a map of all these critical areas, which is a sum of those three things I've mentioned: the tribal lands, parks and forests, and highly populated areas. And so just the quickest overview of what we've seen. Again, essentially 80 to 90% of deposits are in one of these critical areas or within 10 kilometers. So across primary, secondary, tertiary minerals. For rare earth elements, almost all of them currently are being mined out in Eastern Asia. And so we actually only have like 5 or 6, I think, critical elements, deposits of rare earth minerals that we know of in the US right now. So we haven't really counted this because it's at 66%, because 4 out of the 6 are in there. But it doesn't really have a lot of data. As of now, what's interesting is the number in terms of the percent of deposits on critical land is relatively low. For tribal lands, it should be noted that there's actually 5 times more land in the parks data set than the tribal lands. And so this could be boosted the more we normalize it to look at vulnerability. But rather, I guess, more importantly than just trying to point out that there will be impacts, it would be really interesting to look at a spatial resolution. Where are these going to be? Where are there going to be vulnerabilities specific to the present day tribes? And what can we come up with a list of the most vulnerable based on the spatial mapping? That's where we still have a lot more work to do, is diving into the spatial mapping. And what I would love to see is this expand to a global context. I think we're going to have a huge difference when we look at a global context, and I think that's where it's going to be most impactful to come up with this list of maybe vulnerable communities where we need to be keeping an eye on it, especially at like an international level from the UN or the Human Rights Commission, where we're going to expect a lot more human rights violations, indigenous rights violations. And one example of that would be throughout like the Amazon, where we already are seeing that just from forestry. So this is just, again, trying to give some broad overviews of things we're exploring. Again, all this research is pretty new, as it's been we're taking this all to Cornell. I've been here starting my third year, so we've been only really 2 full years at this. And for the students, it's really been 1 year as we're kind of getting into this. But I just kind of wanted to leave this message that there is so much room for making impact with these computational sciences, providing data and thinking about ways that we can leverage them as tribal nations, whether it's self-advocacy, self-governance, or even just how we can tell these stories that could provide safety and empowerment when translated into action and communicated with other institutions and other beings of power, really. And I wanted to end on this quote because we used this in a recent grant, as this was part of what we were working on with the Atanuvik, so up in Nunavik. And this was one of the chief negotiators for the North Quebec Inuit Association, who mentioned that there are many ways to be poor, but in today's world, not having the right kind of information represents a certain kind of poverty. As long as the outsiders decide what is important and are in the position to ask all of the questions, we'll never be able to solve our own problems. And so this was one that was really powerful to me, and the reason why we try to kind of find new ways to get this information. I guess one thing I also wanted to point, because I kind of skipped over, is how important it is for us as Indigenous scholars to think about how do we use computational tools to support Indigenous knowledge systems, because the current trend is is the exact opposite. How can other institutions and academics basically try to pick and pull from Indigenous knowledge systems to kind of serve their own needs? And so I think this is one way that we can try to really shift things in a different direction. So I just wanted to say, thank you. And the two students that really worked on the two projects I showed are Peter Tai, who's Akwesasne Mohawk, and then Jordan Jansen as well. I see the first question. Should I just go ahead and field them myself? Does that work?
Yeah, do it. Thank you.
Okay. Bijiba, did I say that correctly? You can correct me once.
Yeah, sé Bijiba begin. Yeah, Shastina and Ishland, the son of Bashi might so that she need Dashanala, second Bokodishia Hoat. I'm really curious about how community or local governance plug into this information and how to access it. So we work in the Western Agency of the Navajo Nation. This area is inundated with uranium mines. We have one of the largest contiguous solar development projects in the country that's developing in that radiated area, which is really exciting. It's providing the only large-scale economic development in the region. Well, in the chapter, Coal Mine Canyon chapter specifically. Just adjacent to that area, there's the only agricultural sector in a 75-mile radius. So we work very closely as a co-op developer with those farmers to incorporate as businesses, get value-added items off the ground. The long-term goal is a grocery co-op. I used to sit as the president of the Land Use Planning Committee. So we also have as you said, we're on the front lines of climate disaster, the largest growing sand dune, I think, in the country. And there's just a huge lack of data. But with our, we're looking at agrovoltaics. But again, I think I used some cluster maps that were developed by, was it Stanford or Harvard? I forget, that were made available through USDA. And so looking at that, we saw that there was a huge potential to develop our agricultural sector. But beyond that, trying to plug all of our information into somewhere has been a huge challenge. And I'm kind of wondering where you see the overlap.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think there's a few things that come to mind. One is I would love to just hear more and be much more specific around maybe where I think there could be the use of data that maybe you already have, or how, what are the decisions that you're trying to make within the different orgs and government agencies in terms of how, what would be more useful in terms of filling those data gaps. So part of it, I would love to kind of, in a more practical way, follow up and see what we can come up with. In terms of currently what I'm thinking of in terms of where I could see different ways of how this data plugs in. Part of it would be using that larger scale. Again, I like to always think of it as telling stories, but I've been working with looking at the mining impact specific and then taking it to a much smaller level in terms of tribal governments or state governments that want to work and think through these things. What does it look like to protect people? Where do we expect the mining transitions to happen? It's interesting that you brought up the uranium. That's one thing we don't have huge maps on, and I don't know if they're a little bit more privatized, which I imagine they are. But that's something I've been trying to pull in more earth scientists and things as well around there to see what do we think around that. It's also a lot of the projections don't see a huge increase in nuclear, but we also already know the legacy that uranium mining has had in that Southwest. So it's a good question. I think part of it is going to be kind of just more word of mouth, trying to understand, what are the impacts, what's the risk. If the data is useful to help tell that and advocate at different levels, we'd love to make sure that that's available. I think part of it is going to be getting that to be a mainstream part of the conversation as we're making decisions as well. So I think we have some kind of community engagement that we will be doing, specifically through like Utah, which is where most of my partners are, where we'll be doing a lot of community sharing circles, trying to figure out what information is already pretty well known to kind of at a public level and what needs to be, what kind of work do we need to continue. But I would love to follow up as much as you want.
Okay. Do I just email you? I have all the data sets, so I can email that as well.
Perfect. Yeah. Email would be great. Kyle?
Thank you so much for this. I've got so many questions, so many thoughts because I just love all the work that you're doing. But one of the questions is just how can you talk a little bit more about how you are bringing this to local communities and who in tribal communities have been your strongest partners in both taking the data and putting it to use that you and your lab are creating, and in thinking through what other needs exist on the landscape?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's for me, it depends on. I would say that the easy answer is it's been most of my own personal relationships in terms of trying to figure out where I get the most sounding board in terms of what we're working on and trying to tie it. For example, the first one project I kind of did an overview of where we're working up in Nunavik. That one's been very community driven, right? They've came to us and said, here's exactly what we're trying to build. This is what we need. This is we don't have anyone who has this background more in like the machine learning, but here's what we're going for. And so in that sense, it's been completely community driven. We kind of came up with an idea that would help make it a little bit more community, I guess, driven, public driven versus their organization. And so that's something that we're excited to kind of go up there, work in the community next month and try to really get an idea of how the general public wants to interact with the research. But then again, have a very specific plan for how that's being evaluated for usefulness and things like that. This last project that I talked about is part of it is it's been so new we haven't really gotten a chance to take it on the road as you would say. But I think a lot of like where we're starting with that community engagement has been nonprofits trying to figure out organizationally where is that interface of the community, knowing that especially if it's not like home communities for any of us in working on the project, really trying to rely on whoever's there and has a better interface, and as much as they kind of want to help be that direction. I think part of it is, yeah, I would say that's been the probably the biggest driver. There's been one example too where we've been working more at like the state level department. So more through Utah where they have I don't think it's a direct BIA position, but it's a state advisor on, I can't remember the exact position title, but someone that I know as well. But again, that started as a personal relationship where we grew up just running together. So part of it has been trying to translate that into useful community collaborations, but I think some of it is still pretty new and trying to figure out exactly where we'll be, how to do that engagement properly.
Thank you.
Yeah, Kelsey?
Yeah, thank you so much. This was such an interesting presentation. I'm going to ask a question on behalf of one of the climate reporters that I've been working with this summer. She was on earlier, and I'm so sorry she had to jump off before the end of your presentation, but she has been working on a story about mineral rights as that impacts tribal communities. And she was looking for a map. She found this interesting statistic or number that said that like nearly 90% of copper, almost 80% of lithium, and 100% of nickel are located within a 35-mile radius of Native American reservations. And she'd been looking for a map or some kind of visual way to um, communicate that. And then when I saw your maps, I was like, oh my gosh, you were exactly the person she needs to talk to. Would you be willing to, can I give her your contact information and have her reach out to you to learn more about what you're studying and see if maybe there's some collaboration possible?
Yes, yeah, of course. I'd love to, especially, I mean, that's a great way for us to use data too to actually help support more of that community-driven story where they'll have so much more freedom to tell it than we would putting it in university-sponsored blog posts or journal articles. So, yeah, of course, we'd be happy as much as possible. Just get me in contact and we can help them kind of come up and develop those maps as well.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Any other questions from the folks who are still on the call here? Well, Dr. Charles, thank you so much. I know I'll be in touch with you much more because I just love the work that you and your students are doing. Um, but thank you so much for coming and speaking to us and sharing this work. I know that it's really salient to everybody on this call, and will please keep us updated as it develops.
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for everyone for being here and having me. I
Yes,
really
thank you
appreciate it.
for your time. We will be in touch for sure. Just always a pleasure. Really looking forward to hopefully collaborating with you.
Yeah, would love to. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you guys. Thanks for being on, everyone. I'm going to get this Zoom situation figured out for November, I promise. Just a last note, we'll be doing an update on our climate hubs in November. So we'll see everyone then, and we will have a updated link that hopefully works better than this one.